Liberal institutionalism argues that international institutions provide certain benefits to member states. It argues that the information sharing, reduced uncertainty, and relative ease of cooperation make the cost of these institutions, which is primarily agreeing to their articles or requirements, worth it. Today we are going to look more closely at this trade-off, at the costs and benefits of joining an international institution. We will do so by looking primarily at regional organizations, smaller groups of countries that are often more effective because they have fewer members. The benefits of global institutions like the United Nations are often limited, but so are the costs. States rarely give up much when joining the UN or signing a convention. Regional institutions tend to both ask and give a bit more, and we're going to focus on two of the most institutionalized organizations, the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. I want to start with a brief review of how the United Nations works. The UN is a large bureaucracy that coordinates international action in a variety of areas. The UN system includes international organizations like the United Nations Development Program and UNICEF, but in terms of administration, we want to focus on two organizations, the UN General Assembly, or UNGA, and the UN Security Council, or UNSC. The General Assembly consists of all member states and meets once a year in September. If you see in the news that a world leader is giving a speech in New York, it's probably a part of UNGA. UNGA's resolutions generally have symbolic value only. They do decide on the UN budget and admission of new states, but most resolutions are non-binding. The Security Council, by contrast, is a smaller body that meets year-round and passes binding resolutions, often abbreviated UNSCR or UNSCRs. This means that when the UN Security Council passes sanctions, in theory, all members of the United Nations are supposed to pass legislation complying with those resolutions. The UNSC has 15 members. 5 are permanent. The P5. These are the United States, Russia, China, the UK, and France. These permanent members, which for many years were the only nuclear powers at least acknowledged in the world, have veto power in the UNSC. They can prevent the passage of a resolution. The other 10 members are elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms, and there are quotas based on geography for these members. The makeup and powers of the UNSC remain an ongoing area of debate about the fairness of global distribution of power. There are many, many regional international institutions that vary in organization and power. Some, like the Organization of American States, are best known for monitoring elections in member countries. Others, like ECOWAS, promote regional trade, in this case in West Africa. Other organizations like ASEAN are really best known for having great annual meetings. They rarely achieve policy consensus. In this video, I'm going to discuss two of the most institutionalized regional organizations, the EU and NATO. The European Union is primarily designed to create a common market within Europe. This means establishing 4 shared freedoms: free movement of labor, goods, capital, and people. As we discussed in our unit on trade, tariffs are rarely the biggest obstacle to free trade, and so much of what the EU does is develop common economic regulations on everything from organic food to railroad gauges to internet cookies, so that things produced in one country can easily be sold in another. These policies are adopted by consensus. All 27 member states must agree, and this does make the process slow. There are 2 related opt-in treaties that contribute to this common market. The Schengen Treaty removed internal borders, meaning that you don't have your passport checked when you pass from one EU member country to another. And if you receive a Schengen visa, you can travel throughout Europe. The Eurozone countries are those that have chosen to adopt a common currency, the euro. The Eurozone has the fewest members of all European institutions because giving up your currency means ceding control over fiscal policy, which includes the tools to control interest rates and inflation, for example, to the European Central Bank. Structurally, there are 4 key parts of the EU. The European Commission is the bureaucracy that develops regulations, while the Council makes all decisions. The European Parliament has increased in power over the years, but the EU is often criticized for its democratic deficit. Decisions are more often made by bureaucrats than elected officials. Finally, as we will discuss in our conversation about human rights treaties, the European Court of Justice is one of the more effective international courts that examines human rights cases. NATO, by contrast, is a collective defense treaty. Its first Secretary General is often cited as saying the purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out, Americans in, and Germans down. At its core is the idea that an attack on one country is an attack on all member states. This is Article 5 of the treaty, and it was designed to provide an American security guarantee for Europe during the Cold War. In addition to balancing the Soviet Union, it was meant to ensure member states did not feel a need to develop nuclear weapons, as the U.S. nuclear umbrella would cover them, and that Germany would not feel a need to develop its offensive military capabilities to ensure its security. Article 5 has been invoked only once, after September 11th. NATO came to the United States' defense against terrorist attack, and this is why the mission in Afghanistan was a multinational one, called ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force. NATO has, however, engaged in other types of operations meant to promote regional security, most notably in quelling civil wars in the former Yugoslavia, and, less successfully, in Libya. It currently patrols its border with Russia. Member states are allowed to opt out of these preventive operations through a system of national caveats. For example, Germany has often limited the offensive capabilities of its forces for historical reasons. NATO membership overlaps with the EU but is not identical. NATO has had an open-door policy since it was founded, meaning that any European state can apply to join. The application process is a long one, requiring states to meet security commitments and harmonize laws, as well as the interoperability of communications. States interested in this process first engage in intensified dialogue, and then can develop a membership action plan. Sweden and Finland have applied to join after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As with the EU, all decisions made by NATO are by consensus. All 30 member states must agree. And Turkey is currently holding up the membership applications of Sweden and Finland. The last thing to note on NATO membership is the financial commitment. Everyone's favorite complaint about NATO is called burden sharing, how much each member state spends on defense. To be clear, this is not about the actual operational costs of NATO. It is about how much money each country spends on their own security forces. The idea is that NATO members should not just depend on NATO for their security. They need to do their fair share and be ready to contribute to joint operations. NATO member states are supposed to spend the equivalent of 2% of their GDP on defense, although few do. I would note, though, that in 2022, in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Germany decided to increase its military budget to this level, an increase of around $25 billion to a total of $75 billion in defense spending per year. So why do states join these international organizations? EU and NATO membership entails significant costs and reforms, all of which limit state sovereignty. Countries that join decide that the benefits of membership outweigh the costs. EU membership means loss of economic control, but also, in most cases, fiscal stability and access to markets. NATO's security guarantee is highly desirable to countries that feel threatened by their neighbors. In each case, states, and very often their publics, make the strategic calculus about what the value is and choose accordingly.